Hi, this is Ritch Shydner, allegedly a comedian. I've got a new book out, Kicking Through the Ashes, My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. Right now, I'm on Mr. Media. Not allegedly, Mr. Media.
I'm Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview. You can see, hear, and read more than 1,000 of my previous celebrity interviews at MrMedia.com. That's MRmedia.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, iTunes, Apple News, Google Play, or Stitcher, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. On today's show, I'll talk to comedian Ritch Shydner. In addition to sustaining a stand-up career dating back to the late 1970s, he just published a wild memoir, Kicking Through the Ashes, My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. It's about his road days, as a comedian, obviously. It features stories of contemporaries such as Sam Kinison, David Letterman, Jay Leno, Gilbert Gottfried, Jerry Seinfeld, Larry David, Jeff Foxworthy, and many more. So how well regarded is Shydner by his fellow comics? Well, Bill Maher, the host of HBO's Real Time with, Bill Maher, wrote the introduction. Stick around. Comedian Ritch Shydner made a career on stage, painting pictures with words. So it should be no surprise that he transitioned easily to doing the same in book form. What might be surprising is that more comics haven't told their stories in the same way. Shydner's tale, including years of drug and alcohol abuse, women, and repeated attempts to earn his father's respect, gives comedy fans an unprecedented look at his id and ego. We also get a front row seat at life on the road and the friends he made, including Jay Leno, David Letterman, Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, Sam Kinison, Gilbert Gottfried, Jeff Foxworthy, Bill Hicks, and many, many more. Book is like 400 pages, folks, and it's got an index. Speaking of behind the scenes, I must disclose that I have an extra rooting interest in Shydner's book. It was published by Mr. Media Books, which is an extension of this podcast. Ritch and I have gotten to know each other over this past year, and I asked him to read his unpublished manuscript. Being a comedy fan, I love Kicking Through the Ashes and offered to publish it myself. If you love comedy, folks, you gotta have this book. You will not be able to put it down until you are done. Ritch Shydner, welcome back to Mr. Media.
Thanks, Bob.
Great to see you. We talk all the time, but we don't see each other that much, so this is nice. I got to ask you, why a book? I mean, and why the 1980s? What was the significance of that era on comedy?
There were two big eras, I think, in the history of stand-up comedy. One was the late 50s, early 60s, when Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce led that revolution.
Some guy named Cosby, right?
Cosby was involved with it. All those people, Bob Newhart, Jonathan Winters, Shelley Berman, all those guys back then, and women, Phyllis Diller, that turned comedy from sort of like a side dish in show business to an art form. They made it an art form. They made what the comic said was important, and it mattered, and it was personal to the comedian. Instead of this interchangeable, mother-in-law jokes, wife bad, driver jokes that was sort of interchangeable in that era before them. The Milton Berle, big banana comic era, big personality era. And they made comedy conversational in its approach. And they just changed the art form. And then there's the 80s when comedy became a profession, when it became really a main course in show business, a huge force like rock and roll. I mean, Rolling Stone called comedy the rock and roll of the 80s. And it was a transformative period where it went from, my count in 1979, in the whole country, there were about 400 professional comedians, about 400 comics. Today, there are 400 comics in Toledo. I mean, there's so many comedians. I mean, when I was young, if you cracked jokes in class, the teacher would go, "Oh, you think you're funny? Go down and see the vice principal for punishment." But now, I think if some young comic or young funny person in class cracked a joke, the teacher would be like, "You think you're funny? Go see the guidance counselor. You may have a career in comedy." Totally different approach to comedy itself, and that 1980s was part of that. It was huge. That was my era. I started doing it in 77. I hit the wave perfectly when the comedy clubs exploded in 1980, when they just started opening everywhere, paid comedy clubs. You got to understand, before that era, before that time, there were no paid comedy clubs. There were showcase clubs in New York and LA. There was little scenes all. I mean, that's part of the book, is the history of that time. I mean, I really laid out the history of how this explosion happened and what it was like before all the comedy clubs. So I was there right there when it happened.
And you broke out. You're a Jersey guy. You kind of broke out, mostly out of the D.C. area, though, right?
Yeah, yeah. I was going to law school. It was International School of Law and Screen Door Repair. It was no, it was. It became
And they're
George
so
Mason.
proud of you too.
What?
And they're so proud of you as a screen door
They're very
repairman.
proud of me. But my degree from there, I actually did finish my degree, was from George Mason University. But it started off as an independent school. Anyway, so I was going to school there, and a buddy of mine thought I was funny. I thought I was funny. I was always cracking jokes, right, or just hanging around. And he said, "You got to try to do this." I don't even know if we called it stand-up comedy. He just took me down to a coffee house. There were no comedy clubs. Like I said, I didn't even know there were comedy clubs in New York City. I didn't know anything, and I just started doing it. I mean, I'd seen comics. I'd seen George Carlin live. I'd seen Robert Klein live. I'd seen Martin Mull live. I'd seen comics live, but didn't know that it was possible for me to do it. That's all.
Well, the two biggest comics, I think, in that mid to late '70s time were Steve Martin and Robin
I saw
Williams, really,
Steve
right?
Martin twice before I started doing it.
Steve
I
Martin, I
saw,
think, was the first guy that I saw, but I saw him.
yeah.
I saw him at the Rutgers Fieldhouse in New Brunswick. Or actually, it's not New Brunswick. It's across the river from. Anyway, it was the weekend. It was the first live gig he did after he did King Tut on Saturday Night Live,
Oh wow,
and so it
wow,
was like
must have been huge.
people were insane, absolutely insane.
Right,
And
right.
so what I'm wondering is, did Saturday Night Live, having started in '75,
Huge. It was a big factor. It
yeah,
was a factor. I mean, because you saw George Carlin hosted the first Saturday Night Live, Richard Pryor, Albert Brooks, the Billy Crystal. There were a lot of young comics on that show.
Kaufman,
Of
Andy
course, Steve
Kaufman.
Martin, obviously, and Richard Pryor. There were just a lot of comics featured on that show. So, and there was young comics performing on the show. I mean, all those people, that Belushi and Aykroyd and Bill Murray. So '75, we all started looking at that. It just was a timing thing, and just independently, all these scenes popped up in the '70s, like Washington D.C. A guy, Paul Brookman, his parents had this bar. It was a little dinky country western bar in southeast Washington, and he started doing stand-up comedy there. He just put an ad in the Washington Post, like a classified ad. If you want to do comedy, come to this bar. And I showed up, and Louis Black and Kevin Rooney and Ron Zimmerman and John Heyman. All these comics showed up to start doing comedy. T.P. Mulrooney, and so there were scenes in Boston like that. There was a scene in Chicago like that. There was a scene in Houston, Texas like that. There was a scene in Philadelphia, San Francisco. There were a couple of, probably a half a dozen scenes around the country. We didn't even know each other existed. This is pre-internet. Nobody went, oh yeah, there's a scene going on. A guy came to L. Brookman's, like, I think it was like probably like '78, December '78. And he walks up to me. I was the MC. He said, "Listen, I'm a comic from San Francisco." I was like, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah, we got a club like this out there, a Holy City Zoo." I said, "What?" I was like, "What?" He said, "Yeah, we got a bunch of guys like this doing this out there." I was like, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I'd like to do a guest set here because I'm visiting family in D.C." And the next summer, I was like, I got to go out to, he told me about the Comedy Store in L.A., and I had to go check it out.
Well,
And then a friend of mine said, they're doing what you're doing up in New York City too. I was like, really? So she took me up to New York City, and I went in. I couldn't get in. We couldn't get in the Improv. It was a Saturday night, and the Improv was sold out, and it was like 44th and 9th. And then over at Catch a Rising Star was the other comedy club we went to, and they were sold out. I was like, I think on First Avenue around 77, 78. And then 78, 79th Street on Second Avenue was a comic strip, and we got in there. And I remember sitting in there watching this show, and comic after comic would go on stage, and I go, "I'm funnier than this guy. I'm funnier than this guy." And then a guy goes up, and he had great material, great performance, and it was young Jerry Seinfeld. And I went, "Oh, I got some work to do." He right-sized my ego fast.
wow. Well,
Yeah.
the first time we did this, I think back in January of 2016, the first time you were on the show, first time we met, and I told you then that a buddy of mine, Chuck Shepard, who had done some amateur comedy at the same time you were starting up, and then went on to create the News of the Weird uh,
I love that. I
thing.
love that.
So I had questions from him last time, and this time I have questions from another buddy of mine who bought your book and is is about halfway through it. Knew I was going to talk to you, so I'm going to interrupt my own regularly scheduled stuff with some stuff from him. I'll be curious to see your take on this, but I'm going to read you exactly what he said, and then he has some questions and some comments. So
Okay.
This is from a fellow named Ken Folsom, who is a DC guy, um, military guy, college graduate. I think maybe it says in here. Anyway, he says, reading the book, I realized that I saw Ritch perform twice in D.C. Once at the infamous Plasmatics show at the Ontario Theater.
He
Uh,
was there.
you know that show.
I tell that story.
Okay, all right. He says you were met with raging hatred, and then once once at the Bayou, he says not sure of the feature act, but you were received with complete indifference. He said so. He has three questions for you, and then at the end there's a comment. So are you game for this?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, all right. So from Ken, question number one. He said Ritch was in D.C. during the heyday of freeform radio. WHFS and all the university radio stations played a lot of comedy cuts.
Yeah.
Georgetown, American, Howard had great radio stations. My favorite was a program on American University Radio called Shaved Face. Comedy album cuts with jazz music played as segue. Think it was about 11 or midnight on Thursdays or Fridays at the major stations. Willard Scott, Larry King, Greaseman, Howard Stern, and Petey Green all lived locally
Yeah.
and had very, very funny daily radio shows during the time that you were in D.C. Were you influenced by the DC airwaves at all? He wants to know.
I remember Shade. I remember that. I remember that. I remember of course I remember Petey Green, Howard Stern, all those. I remember that. I was not influenced by him because I wasn't listening to a lot of radio, morning radio. I just really wasn't. But I just loved the fact that he was there at the Ontario when I performed for the Plasmatics, because really I came up on the line. I came out there. It was really just raging. They were just yelling at me, and you could only say F you to them so many times in so many ways. And finally, I just said, look, I'm out here for 15 minutes. They're not coming out any earlier if I leave. If you kill me now, they won't come out earlier. They'll just watch my body decompose on stage, and it kind of got a laugh, right? And I came off, and Wendy O. Williams, she used to perform. She would just like electrical tape over her nipples.
Right.
That was all she had. She was bare chested.
Right.
And she's standing there when I came off, and she just hands me a beer, and she says, "I'll go get those fuckers. Don't worry. Watch this."
I'm trying to think. It was about 83, 84. I interviewed Wendy in Plasmatics by phone, thank God, because I don't think I could have handled it in person. And she always reminded me of my Aunt Ida. She and my Aunt Ida are both heavy smokers, and they both talk like this. They Bobby,
Yeah,
get me some
yeah,
cigs, will you?
yeah,
And
yeah.
oh my God, it's so funny to talk to her. So I can imagine. All right, so here's the second one. The king of comedy in D.C. at that time was definitely Mark Russell. He was a great entertainer who played piano, sang songs dripping with political satire, and had a very underrated stand-up routine. He wants to know if you saw Russell and if he had any impact on you.
I did see Russell. I went to see Russell perform, and then afterwards, I brought him. I'd written a whole bunch of material that I thought he could use. So I came back and brought this material, and he was very nice and gracious. And I got a message back from his office, some sort of note or something about his office that Mark doesn't take unsolicited material.
Ah.
That he has his own writers, and he had his own writing himself. And which was a nice way of saying your stuff stinks, I guess. I'm not really sure what he was saying, but he was very nice. But actually saw him twice. I went to see him once, and then I came back after seeing him with the material I wrote. So there was also at the time who was in town, which was Mort Saul had a radio show for a while. He was in town. Completely opposite. I contacted Mort. I called on the air. Right? And I'm a young comic, and he went on a rant about how bad young comics were and how bad comics were. Terrible. I mean, I felt bad. I was listening to the radio. Just God, hang up. And he went on. The rest of the show was talking about how terrible young comics are, how bad we are. And we invited. I would call to invite him down to El Brookman's. We're like, come on down and see what we're doing, or maybe do a set there or something. That'd be great. Oh my God, he was angry, man, bad. I don't know what was going on there, but it was not good.
Well, I thought you were going to say that you tried to sell him the material that Mark Russell wouldn't buy.
Here's the material that Mark Russell wouldn't take. No.
But it's interesting to me that you made that unsolicited attempt to sell jokes to Mark Russell. Later, I mean, you sold jokes to a lot of people.
I wrote jokes to a lot of people, and I'm not saying that those jokes, they probably weren't exactly in the form he used.
Sure.
I was writing political material, but I loved writing, and the reason I got into performing was I was writing funny stuff all the time, and you can't get people to read it. I remember I would hand something to a friend and then stand there to watch them read it. I go, no, go ahead, read it right now, because I wanted to see their reaction. And I'd be like, "Did you get down to this part yet?" Like when I knew I thought the funny part was coming, on the page. I'd be like, "They go, no, I've got it. You didn't find that funny? You didn't think that was funny?" I mean, I couldn't get a reaction from people that I needed to find out whether my things were funny or not. So I had to go on stage to find out. That's why I performed. I thought I was a terrible performer. I was scared to go up there, and I only went up there to try to get laughter from the things that I was writing.
And you now I don't know if you'll have to stop me here. I won't name any names, but because I don't know if this is something that's public. But I know that in recent months you sent some jokes to some political jokes to somebody rather famous, and got them used. Is that something you can
Bill
talk
Maher.
about? Oh, okay. So I don't know
Oh
if
yeah,
that was.
sure. Bill doesn't mind. He doesn't mind. No, I sent jokes to Bill during the campaign. Obviously, none of our jokes affected the campaign. So, Mark Twain's little saying about nothing can stand the government's fall before humor, or whatever he said, I can't remember, really has no application in 2016, according to our experience, because I read a million great jokes
Yeah.
that didn't stop the juggernaut at all.
So you're still offering up jokes to other comics. I think that's interesting.
Oh, yeah. If I can't use them. I'm not a political comedian on stage. I stopped doing it a long time ago. Rodney Dangerfield once said, "Listen to what the audience is laughing at." That's one of the reasons why I was taping myself, not just to help structure the material and the jokes, but to find out what they found funny in you, is what he said. Find out basically what they're thinking is funny about you. And I noticed that when I did political material, the audience didn't bite so much. But when I did jokes about men and women or other things of that nature, they laughed a lot. So I went to where I was getting the laughs, and I just started handing my political material off to other people.
All right, and we're gonna come back to Home Improvement in a second. Speaking of jokes about men and women, but I want to get in Ken's last comment here.
Sure.
He says that you have a lot of song lyrics and titles for chapter headings, which I know you appreciate that somebody noticed, because I know how hard you worked on those. Ken says, Rich is a music fan. Could you ask him if the crazy DC music culture of punk, LA and DC were the two centers of hardcore music at the time, bluegrass, great tradition of local talent with the Birchmere being one of the premier venues in the country, and go-go, which never took off nationally but was fun and sometimes violent concerts to attend with some great musicians and bands. What's the question in here, Ken? He wants to know if the crazy DC music culture influenced you at all, because we know you are a big music fan.
Huge music fan, and I saw so many Bob Marley. I saw so many bands and I opened up for a lot of bands. And Ken was talking about the Bayou. I opened up for a lot of bands there in the Cellar Door and in the Merriweather Post Pavilion and Lisner Auditorium. I opened up for a lot of bands and a lot of places there because I was working for Cellar Door Productions. So I was getting into a lot of shows too for free at that time, And I loved the scene. I don't know if it affected me. I actually opened up for Seldom Scene, which is a very popular bluegrass band in the D.C. area. And I think I opened up for a couple of other different bands at the Birchmere, which was a big bluegrass venue. And they were great audiences to open for because they were very into listening, and they were receptive. The best audiences I've worked for were jazz audiences, opening up for like Mose Allison or Tony Williams or those kind of crowds. And the bluegrass audiences were the best, most receptive. Rock audiences, like, they didn't even know what I was doing out there. I mean, I come walking out without a guitar. They're like, what is he doing? A lot of times the introduction wouldn't even include the fact that I was a comedian. Like, please welcome Ritch Shydner. And go, what is he going to do? Poetry reading? Was this Robert doing? I mean, so I love the music scene, but I don't know. I guess I was influenced by all the rock and roll that I'd grown up with. And I am really happy, as you said, that Ken noticed that every title of a chapter was a song lyric.
Yep.
And just songs of my favorite songs are songs that applied to that chapter. I try to match it up. You're right, I did do a lot of work on it.
Oh, I know.
But I could never play myself. I tried playing guitar for years. I was terrible. When I first started performing, I took a guitar on stage for a while, tried to do song parodies. And I could not sing and strum the guitar at the same time. In fact, I couldn't strum the guitar at all, really, but I couldn't sing at all. So it was a terrible combination of not being able to sing and not being able to play the guitar and not being able to get a laugh. So I wrote 2 song parodies. One was called Running on Money, which was a thing about government spending so much money. And this was back in 1978 or 77, whenever I wrote it, to Jackson Browne's Running on Empty. That was one song parody. And the other one was Born to Bowl, based on Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. And I gave them both to a comedian who was a guitar act. And that's that.
Okay. Well, last comment from Ken, and then we're going to move back to the professional questions, maybe.
I'm still blown away that he was at the Plasmatics show. That's what cracks me.
Oh, that's great. All right. Ken says, finally, tell him I'm sorry I booed him both times I saw him. But I was a young punk of 18, so that's my defense. So thank you, Ken. Ken's a good reader of stuff. He was very excited to have your book. So I mentioned Home Improvement, and in the book you talk about at one point your act was very much power tools and men and women, and then this guy from Detroit shows up independently. There was no accusation of theft, but he starts basically doing the same act.
But it was different, and the key difference was I was mocking men for their power tool usage. I had a joke. I said I got into vacuuming, and like any guy, once I got into it, I wanted to get the best equipment possible. I got the new Hoover 300 horsepower riding vacuum cleaner, and something of that nature. And I had a couple other jokes of that. And I did a tour called the Power Tool Tour. Bring a power tool, get in free. And people actually showed up with power drills and stuff and walked in the door, and that was kind of fun to me. But I didn't take it as sort of like a anything more than just it was a phase I was going through. But Tim, he was a masculinist. I think he even called himself a masculinist, and his thing was glorifying men. And it was a great, perfect timing, because there was sort of this reaction by men to the whole feminist Alan Alda sort of masculinity of sensitivity, and it was sort of a reaction at the time in the 80s, and I think he surfed that wave perfectly. And I was on the wrong side of that equation, because I was still kind of like not an apologist, but just and I am who I am, based upon my personality and dynamic of who I was in my family as a kid growing up. My job with my mom was protection and support. So I have a different viewpoint than Tim. That's all.
I have a funny Tim Allen is who we're talking about. I don't know if we named him by last name, but my wife and I were in Atlanta a few years ago. I had a football book, Why Men Watch Football, and I was promoting it at Radio Row at the Super Bowl in Atlanta that year, 1993, 94, somewhere around there. And we're coming through the airport, or we're maybe with the CNN Center, I don't know, we're somewhere in Atlanta, and right in front of us is Tim Allen. He's walking ahead of us. He's carrying his overnight bag or whatever. I guess he was probably performing in the city. And my wife, who you've had some dealings with, she edited the book actually, and who never says anything bad about anybody, out of her mouth is, God, that Tim Allen is so unfunny. And he turned around and he looked at her, and he's like, and she was just mortified. And I'm like, what on earth were you thinking, saying that out loud? First of all, Tim, should you see this, I don't agree. I do actually enjoy you, but my wife, I want to steer clear of her. Anyway,
That's funny.
So I want to steal a line from Mark Maron and ask you a WTF type question. But I'm wondering, who were your guys in the 80s in terms of who did you want to emulate as you're coming up and building your career, and who were your contemporaries who had an impact on you, even if it's just a matter of becoming buddies,
Well, there were a lot of comics that I worked with that sort of spurred me on or inspired me to work hard. Mike McDonald, the comedian from Canada, was a really good friend, and I loved his comedy, and he went at it as hard as he could, and I always felt like I wanted to do the same. So he inspired me. Rick Overton, who's still doing stand-up comedy, and he was always real free up there, really pushing it. And guys like Larry Miller, who I always felt was not just a great performer, but a great writer. And there were comics like that who were contemporaries that I that I watched them and it made me push harder. Jerry Seinfeld, who obviously had a tremendous work ethic to go with that talent. So there were guys who they were contemporaries, but then the people who obviously who I looked ahead that inspired me even to do it to begin with were Robert Klein, George Carlin, obviously, Martin Mull, who I thought was hilarious. I couldn't do his style, but Steve Martin, who to me brought such that the freedom when he was performing, it was almost that dare not to care sort of thing. Right. That I loved. Even later on, when a guy like Kevin Meaney, who's gone now, he had that sort of freedom up there. That he went on Tonight Show singing that song, "I Don't Care, I Don't Care," which I always thought was outrageously brave and wild. So there were a lot of comics who I watched and were inspired by, who I love watching. Like I still go out of my way to watch a guy like Bobby Slayton today. Now Bobby's not my style at all, and I don't agree with everything he says, but I love everything he says because he's saying it from this is true to him, and he's funny. He's one of those guys that just talks funny, moves funny. To me, he's just a funny guy. Like there's people who are just funny, like a Red Fox was just funny.
Oh
like
yeah.
Right. So there's so many people that I love watching. And get inspired. I watched two young comics last night at the Improv. I was at a show here in L.A. and I performed at the Melrose Improv. And there were two young comics in front of me, and I really enjoyed watching them. I just thought, wow, I can see the difference in the art form and their approach, and I appreciated it.
So as much traveling as you do these days, you still went down to the Melrose Improv and got up on stage and performed just for...
Yeah. And 10 o'clock show is a late show for me. I'm more of an early bird special kind of guy now. Yeah. But it was great doing it, and I had fun. And I walked on front and stage, and it was just, the audience was filled with young people my kids' age. And, once you acknowledge, look, my first line is, okay, here now you're going to hear from the older demographic. And they laugh. And once you acknowledge, I know I'm older than you, and get that out of the way, and then just do what you do. And they laughed. I told stories. In fact, I told stories. I told showbiz stories. I told stories from the book. And
I think it's a great idea. And I was going to ask you, you were on the something called the Carson podcast, where they just talk. The host only talks to people who've been on the Carson show or had some connection, and it was really interesting. I've read the book, obviously, but you did Carson, the Johnny Carson Tonight Show. Just to be clear, as the host of that show kept saying, the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He felt he had to add that each time he said it. But you did it 13 times?
I think it was. I was like 14. I think it was 14.
14.
I think I did 4 with Leno, something like that.
And Carson was pretty damn important in the early stages of your career, right?
Huge. It became less important as cable TV took over and there were more venues. But when I was young, there were 3 channels, and at late night, 11:30, when the newscasts were finished, Johnny's was the only show that was live or taped, but it was the other 2 channels would show old movies or old TV shows. So the comedy show of late night was Johnny Carson. That was it. There was no competition. He was the gatekeeper. Mm-hmm. And it really was, you performed like a jester, like a court jester. You had to make Johnny laugh. If Johnny didn't find you funny, you weren't coming back. So it really was a court jester sort of situation. And everybody in my era looked at that show as, maybe not everybody, but most of the comics I knew looked at that show as that's where you got to get to and score on that show to move your career forward. That was sort of a career stamp. And my dad loved Johnny Carson, and I wanted my dad's approval, so it was doubly important to me.
And at one point, your dad actually said something to you about Johnny, right?
I did one of the, I wasn't guaranteed panel every time, but I'd look over. Sometimes it was Depp, and sometimes they go, look, if we might not have time, look over to Johnny. He'll give you the signal to either come over or I go, okay. So one night I finished my set. It was a great set, and I finished it. I looked over, and Johnny just gave me the A-OK sign, which meant no panel tonight. Thank you very much. And instead of just turning and walking back to the curtain, I always loved the image to me of gunfighter. I've always felt like I was a gunfighter, coming into a new town and making my reputation and my name as a gunfighter slinger, and I just pulled my jacket back like a gunfighter in the saloon. I had my hand on my gun on my hip, and I backed it to the curtain, looking warily at the audience, looking around like, where's the trouble going to come from? And Johnny's laughing. You can hear it on the tape. I still have the tape. Johnny's laughing, and Ed McMahon goes, "What's he doing?" And Johnny goes, "He's doing a gunfighter. It's great." And my dad called me up the next day. Now, my dad never reacted to any of my Tonight shows or Letterman's. And he called me up and he said, "You got Johnny laughing with that gunfighter thing. You're really funny. You're good at this." And when he said, "You're good at this," it was like the weight was off my shoulder.
Made a really big, yeah, I know it was a big thing for you. I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I know you got to get going. So I don't want to keep you too long. But no, not many, but a lot of comedians are known for basically cutting their wrists on stage every night. They just let all this personal stuff out about themselves. That's not really your thing so much. But in the book, I mean, you really there's not a lot you held back.
Why? There's no sense of holding back, and I know confessional comedy is huge now. I think more than ever. It's taken the conversational comedy that Lenny Bruce started and taken it to another level of, confessing your greatest sins or your greatest faults or whatever it is. And I enjoy it. I watch it, and I'm not really certainly right that that's my stop. But in the book, if I'm going to write a book about stand-up comedy and about my journey through it, everything has to come out. And I don't think I left anything out.
Now you've got kids, you've got a couple ex-wives out there. Did you did you anticipate that coming clean?
I just realized when you said that, I'm one of those guys. You got a couple ex-wives, you got a couple of kids.
Hey,
I'm one of those guys.
I mean, listen, our president-elect is the same way, right? No, let's not put you in that group. But what I'm saying is, you come clean with so many of these stories. You tell a lot of things. You in the book, in some places, you do bleed all over the page. You just tell us everything. The book's been out a little bit now. Have you gotten any feedback from your kids or any of the exes? Has anyone given you a sense that they feel that they know you better, or they wish you hadn't told quite so much?
Nobody. There were two people who contacted me about, please don't put this story in that happened and they were involved in, and it would not make them look good. And they're good guys, and they made mistakes years ago, and I didn't put those stories in. I tried not to hurt anybody. Other than myself, I don't mind putting my warts in, but I tried to keep it, so nobody complained. People who in the book are fine with it. My kids read the book and they loved it. They learned things about me they didn't know, and I had great conversations with them about it. So I have not heard from the exes, but the kids love it, and that's really more important to me.
One of the things that's fascinating in the book for me is, I think your first wife was Carol your first wife?
Carol Leifer was the first wife.
Yeah,
right.
and of course, you both have gone on to have fine careers. And when you were together, you didn't have kids, but you were both road comics. You're out all the time. Right. It was fascinating to read. I mean, you talk honestly about, you were competitive with her, and she was really hot shit. Audiences loved her.
We were both very competitive. Absolutely. We're trying. Look, we met probably around when I moved to New York in '79. I think we probably started dating around '80 or whatever. And we got married in '81. We were both insecure about our status in our careers. We were both trying to make a mark, and we were both working real hard to do that. And the relationship, I think, was always secondary to our careers.
You talk. I'm probably not going to give this as much time as it deserves, but you do talk in the book about drug and alcohol use. You really kind of hit bottom at one point.
Absolutely.
When did you realize that it was something you had to deal with and not something you just had to get through day to day? That there was a bigger problem?
Well, it was impacting my career. It was taking away my sense of humor, which was my most prized possession. I mean, there's nothing I value more than my sense of humor, and it took that away. It took the one thing away that I thought was most important to me, was that. And it was impacting my career. I messed up on my second Tonight show, which is in the book about that. I think it was a lot of to do with alcohol and drugs, and I just was. It's a cliche, sick and tired of being sick and tired. I was caught in a hellish Groundhog Day where every day was the same. I get up, I start drinking. I know I'd start doing drugs at a certain point. I was unable to stop. And fortunately, there's a place where you can go to, and everybody knows about it. But I mean, there's a place you can go, and I got help from people, and I continue to do that. Go to those same places and help other people, and it's the best thing. It turned my life around. It changed everything. All the good things that happened in my career, all the really positive things that happened after I got sober, after I quit drinking and drugging. So there's no reason for me to ever start again. First of all, I'm too old. I don't have any cute drunks left in me.
How many
pathetic drunks?
How many clean years under your belt now?
May 11th, 1985. So 31 years plus.
Congratulations. Yeah. That's pretty amazing. Because you're in an industry. You go to a place every night where you're surrounded by.
Yeah, I watched people drink last night. I mean, I watched Jake Johansson did a show at the Improv before I got there, and he came off stage and he had a cocktail. I was talking to him, and he's standing there holding his martini, and I was like, "That's great. You can have a martini once in a while. Relax after you've done your work and have a little drink." But that's probably all Jake had was one martini.
Well,
it's not my story.
As your publisher, I want to put on my publisher hat for a minute. There is if you go to Disneyland or Disney World, there's something called Hidden Mickeys, where all over the parks and everything they do, there's Mickeys hidden in places, and part of the fun for people who go all the time is to find the hidden Mickeys. Well, there's hidden Shydner gags, pretty much in plain sight on the cover of Kicking Through the Ashes, right? Now,
that's right.
I don't know. No one has said a word to me about this, and I know how hard you worked on picking the images in the background on the cover. Do you want to let people in on the joke, or just kind of give them a hint of what to look for?
My name legally is Shydner, and people had a hard time pronouncing it, so I put the Y in there instead of just changing my name to. I played with different names when I first started. Elvis DeGroot was a name I went on stage behind that one. I played with different names. But I went with Ritch Shydner, thought just changing the I to a Y, people instead of saying Shydner would say Shydner. Well, they never got it right. And then the ads in newspaper ads always misspelled it. So all those ads on the cover are misspelled ads. I have tons of them. And in fact, one of my favorite ones on the cover is the Cleveland Comedy Club when they put my name misspelled with Shirley Hempel's picture. Shirley Hempel is a very funny black woman.
What's happening?
Yeah, from What's Happening. So that was one of my favorite all-time mess-ups. But they didn't care. I mean, they really didn't care about the ads in the papers because the clubs were packed. So you just let them know there was a comedy club open and people are coming. But that's the fun of all those ads. Remember there was one where I think Ritch Shydner was one of the names. Skydiver. How did they get Skydiver out of Shydner? It's hilarious to me.
Well, if I had any inkling, if I had any inkling for a moment that you made that stuff up. There was a radio interview you did just in the last month with I don't want to say where it was. I don't want to embarrass the guy more directly than I'm about to. But this guy, you were scheduled to be on the show at the end of his hour, and so from the beginning of the show for 45 minutes, he kept referring to, and coming up, we'll have comedian Ritch Shydner. Ritch Shydner coming up real soon, and he says it over and over, and every 10 minutes he says Ritch Shydner, and then finally. He brings you on. He turns on your microphone, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, joining me now is the author of Kicking Through the Ashes, Ritch Shydner." And then there's a pause, and he says, "Ritch, am I pronouncing your name correctly?" And I was just like, "Oh my God, this really happens. This poor man's gone." I mean,
and how do you get Shydner out of SHY?
Oh, that's it.
See, when I grew up, I always got that because the I they think it's short, but. It's a messed up name, and I should have changed it, but I don't know. Whatever. It doesn't matter.
I couldn't believe this guy kept saying Ritch Shydner over and over again, and it never occurred to him. I mean, when I have somebody on this show, before we start recording for real, I make sure I know how to pronounce their name, especially if it's going to come out Shydner.
I did before Arnold Schwarzenegger was famous, probably like 82 or 83, I did a Merv Griffin show with him. And he was just trying to make it in Hollywood as an actor. And his name was Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I thought, if this guy, and this is before he became famous, I thought if this guy's going to stick with Schwarzenegger, I can stick with Shydner.
Yeah.
And of course, he never had a problem. But there's a talent difference, I guess, between Arnold and I didn't account for that talent difference.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say it was a talent. Well,
Yeah,
we
it's
won't go
okay.
there. We won't go
Yeah.
there. All right, so wrapping up here. So the book is out.
Yes.
What about you? Got uh, at least one major bookstore appearance coming up, right?
I got Book Soup here in Los Angeles, over in West Hollywood, which I can't wait to do January 7th here in Los Angeles. I can't wait to do that because that's a place that's I've been to other book signings there, and it's just to me the coolest bookstore in LA. And I'm going to try to do some other things here, but that's coming up January 7th.
All right. And folks, listen, you can order stand-up comedian Ritch Shydner's new memoir. You wouldn't think I'd need to look down to get the title right? You would think I would know it by now after 6 or 8 months. But it is Kicking Through the Ashes: My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. You can order it from great bookstores anywhere on the planet, or you can get it right now at a great price from MrMedia.com. If you're watching on MrMedia.com, right below the video, left or right, you'll see the cover of the book. You can click on it. It'll take you to Amazon. You can download it as an ebook immediately, or you can have it sent to you as a paperback. Again, the paperback is like 400 pages. You get a great deal here. It's packed with stuff. And yes, I am a little prejudiced because I did publish the book, but it is just, I love comedy, and that's why I wanted to publish the book. It is such a great read. It is, believe it or not, it is 81, 82 separate chapters. So it's really easy to digest. You can read a couple chapters at a time, or you can read the whole thing. Great book. And your website, richshydner.com,
Right.
Shydner.
Yeah, the funny thing is, Rich is Ritch. That's on the birth certificate. Ritchshydner. Thanks, Bob.
You just want to make it difficult for people. And you are on Twitter and Facebook. People can find you in those
Yeah.
places.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Ritch, it's been a real pleasure for me this past year getting to know you, having you back on the
Bob.
show, and publishing the book. And as always, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Media, today.
Thanks, Bob.
To believe her, a bad idea to believe her. Turn up the stereo receiver. Turn up the stereo receiver.
Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience full of comedy road dogs who went straight to the index of Ritch Shydner's new book to see what secrets he told about them in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hi, this is Ritch Shydner. If you've ever wondered what it was like to be a stand-up comedian in the 1980s, I'm going to do you a big favor. Instead of billions of dollars for a time machine, you can just spend $24.95 and buy my new book, Kicking Through the Ashes: My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. It will save you money and give you thrills. It will take you there. Go to my website, richshydner.com, go to amazon.com, and buy this book.